And that, my friends, is how America was made great once again. Breaking at this hour, Jimmy Sengenberger is currently at the crossroads of politics and economics. Radio broadcaster master, now the celeb on the web. He's the smarty of the party. He's in cahoots with the grassroots. Jimmy at the Crossroads brings you thought-provoking commentary, hard-hitting interviews, original satire, and the best bumper music known to man. Jimmy at the Crossroads!
Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix, I said. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. People want answers, they want to understand. They come to the crossroads and Jimmy gives them the plan. I said, gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Hello, my friends, and welcome to another edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner, once again bringing engaging, intelligent talk, Sang style, and doing our level best to make sense out of nonsense. It is the second to last day of July, the 30th. It's remarkable how time is flying right on by. Sunday, I'm just a few days away from my birthday. It's pretty crazy to think about how fast time flies. So good to be with you today. If you have not subscribed to the YouTube channel, please do. YouTube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. Also, log on to Twitter, follow me. At Sang Center. You see it right there, Sang with an E, not an A, Center on Twitter and on Facebook, facebook.com/Jimmy Sengenberger Pro. We'll take you to Jimmy Sengenberger Media Personality, my official Facebook page, and also jimmyatthecrossroads.com, your way to access the shop, the Crossroads Club, all of our content and so much more. And of course, be sure to follow and like, subscribe, all those good things to our friends and partners at the Washington Examiner on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and of course at WashingtonExaminer.com. So today is going to be very interesting. It's the show of Johns, I guess. In the second segment, we've got Professor John Yoo of UCLA Berkeley's Law School. He's going to come on and talk about his new book, Defender-in-Chief, about President Trump and presidential power and the Constitution. Very fascinating read. But first today, we've gotten some startling GDP numbers. A drop in the second quarter of more than 9% as the coronavirus pandemic continues to sow very difficult times, along with government policies related to that pandemic. Or perhaps I've reversed the order. We'll talk with our first guest about that. But the annualized rate, according to the Commerce Department, is 32.5% negative GDP growth. That means the economy slowed quite a bit in the second quarter of 2020. What are the implications of this? Plus, big tech yesterday. 4 CEOs, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Apple, Facebook, Google, we had 4 of them. I'm forgetting the other one right at this moment. But we had 4 big tech CEOs testify before Congress just yesterday. What are we to make of that in these antitrust hearings? Let's talk about it all with the editor of RealClearMarkets, a vice president at FreedomWorks, the author of numerous books, I think perhaps most famously Popular Economics. John Tamny rejoins us after quite a little bit of a hiatus from the program. John, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Jimmy, thanks for having me on.
It's so good to have you on, my friend. And hey, by the way, I don't think you've seen the show open before. What'd you think of that?
I'm very impressed. Wow, you're multi-talented. And
You
so
know, harmonica's just something fun to do, and when it's pure fun, you just let it flow, let the passion
that's
flow.
right.
So John, 32.5% negative annualized growth from the second quarter, 9.5% negative growth for the second quarter. What are we to make of this? And should we even be looking at annualized growth? Should we even be looking at gross domestic product in the first place? Who's actually going to ask that question in this day and age, John?
Yeah, in a perfect world, we wouldn't even measure it. There's no reason to measure economic growth. But let's be clear that when you shut down a quarter of the U.S. economy, you're going to have, quote, lower GDP or just lower economic growth. GDP, as we've talked about for years, measures growth that already happened. GDP is a consumption figure. Well, how do we consume? We produce first. And so GDP, among other things, as we've discussed, measures government spending as a growth input. Well, governments can only spend insofar as the growth already occurred, as in they took in taxable revenue. And so with GDP, you're looking at a backwards number that measures what the growth that already happened. That it's down is probably a good sign. It means people are consuming less. And as we know, when they consume less, capital formation grows, savings grow. That's how businesses grow. It's through investment. Everyone wants to consume. That's easy. The challenge is getting people to save and invest, which creates the seed that farmers would use in old times to grow.
So if GDP in this case, in all cases, isn't a very reliable metric, but we know the economy is slower, is it worse than what GDP suggests because it includes government spending and considers that as an input that's helping to grow the economy and keep it afloat? Or is it better, or is that an inappropriate question to ask?
Yeah, it's a good question to ask, but I don't think it's worse. I think the problem is once again with the measurement. Yes, there's no doubt that to add government spending to it involves double counting of the worst kind. The growth already occurred, hence governments can spend. So you could argue in GDP terms that it's worse, but so what? This is just a bankrupt number. It's something that measures just production, just for production's sake and consumption for consumption's sake. Based on that, you go back to the 1970s, the Soviet Union and China had pretty big economies. We know they didn't.
John Tamny, one more question related to the economic malaise, and then I want to jump into big tech. We have seen the stimulus package, so-called, trillions of dollars spent to help keep the economy afloat, provide relief. Previously, now they're debating $1 trillion or more in some kind of relief and stimulus package. At the same time, we're seeing increasing restrictions in various states in the economy because we're seeing these flare-ups of the virus, and they feel that that's the way that we need to go. How do you assess those aspects of the economic malaise that we're facing right now, and whether or not government can be effective in helping to provide some support for people at this time?
I assess them as slowing the recovery. It's that simple. Governments can only spend insofar as economic growth produces the existing and future resources for them to spend. And so there's no such thing as government spending. What there is there's politicized allocation of private sector production. So rather than Jeff Bezos and Sundar Pichai and Mark Zuckerberg and those guys allocating resources, Fred Smith of FedEx, you have Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy. So as a rule, the government spending is going to slow economic growth. So I think it's very unfortunate. I think it's triply unfortunate that there was all this talk during the first round of spending that, oh my gosh, Shake Shack's going to get some money. Shame, shame. Harvard's going to get some money. If only that's all governments did. What people should have been offended by is that these guys wrecked the economy based on their own alarmism and then proceeded to extract $3 trillion more in order to politically allocate. The damage they've done is just staggering. Think how much more the economy would be growing if they were not if they'd not arrogated themselves the right to allocate capital.
However, one may respond saying the virus is flaring up. We've had about 150,000 Americans who have died of the virus. In certain parts of the country, hospitalizations are reaching maximum capacity for their wards that are devoted to COVID-19. And therefore, there are certain places where we need these kinds of restrictions, whether we like them or not. What say you to that?
Well, yes, but as if it's really flaring up, if people are really just terrified about this virus, then what's the point of shutdowns? What's the point of restrictions? See, I don't need a law to avoid illness. I purposely avoid, before I go on vacation, anytime, any part of the year, I avoid doing things where I might be around germs just because I don't want to miss out on the vacation. I don't need a law to not do something that might kill me. And so let's not get into the numbers here. The numbers are ludicrous. The numbers support the idea that politicians have wholly overreacted. Start with liberty first. If it's assumed that this exists as a grave danger to us, then politicians are wholly superfluous. People will on their own adjust their lives, and they did that exactly before politicians decided to come in and wreck the economy. And so, no, there's no excuse for what's taken place. A disastrous loss of liberty. What I hope is that people have learned a lesson from it.
So yesterday, shifting gears here with you, John Tamny, our guest, VP at FreedomWorks, and of course, editor of RealClearMarkets. Yesterday, we had once again, this situation when you have CEOs come before Congress about big tech issues and antitrust. This was in a subcommittee, so a more narrowly tailored group of people. It was the first time, and this was the company that I was forgetting, Amazon. It was the first time that Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos had yet testified before the United States Congress. And I have to say, I think that he did a pretty darn good job for it being his very first time. And I want to put up pick one here because this is something that has been highlighted as the market share of these four companies and the amount of wealth that they've got. They're putting this out there, folks saying, oh, the USA's got $21.44 trillion, China $14.14 trillion, Japan $5.14 trillion in wealth and value in the economy, and Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook alone take up $4.8 trillion of wealth in the American economy. A staggering number, it would seem, and therefore it shows just how powerful those companies are and perhaps in need of antitrust policies put into effect against those companies and or additional regulation. What say you to that, John Tamny?
Oh dear, where do you begin? Well, the first thing is, if they're worth that much, boy, they must have met some remarkably unmet needs from before. And all we need to know that is to imagine our lives without Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple. Life would be much, much, much more complicated and difficult. The next thing I'd say is that I'm proud to admit it. I bought shares of Amazon back in 1999. I never sold the vast majority. Thank goodness. And my point there is that I was ridiculed for owning Amazon for many, many years. Why would you own such a company that will never make a profit, that is selling things online? People never see what Amazon was, that it was Amazon.org. It got to where it is today because Jeff Bezos thinks he has no power, because he is desperately fearful of losing the market share that he has. So he spends billions every year on losing ideas, looking for ways to make people view Amazon as indispensable, given his view that he doesn't view it as indispensable. So he keeps spending to meet our needs. I'll add one other thing that I learned from you. If you go back to 2006, Google still had less page views or less visits than MySpace. The view that I learned from you from some tech reporter, I think in England, said that MySpace is so powerful that if we don't rein it in, it will eventually control much of the internet. How'd that work out? Let's go back to 2000, one more thing. What were the most powerful internet companies at the time? AOL and Yahoo. Where are they today? Rest assured that if you keep having me on for the next 10 or 15 years, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, a lot of these will not be nearly as powerful as they are.
And I have a clip that gets to that point because I was thinking about exactly that. You think about Facebook now was established in 2004. MySpace was the king in 2006. You had articles saying there's no way, even 2008, articles saying there's no way that MySpace is going to be pushed aside. It has a monopoly. Well, in Cut 3, Representative Jayapal grilled Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook's business model. And this is what happened, what she said in what he said in an exchange after she went through some of the ways in which Facebook went about purchasing Instagram and trying to increase its share of the market in certain areas and grow its business?
We're going to make sure that we build the best products in all of the spaces that we can around helping people stay connected with the people they care about.
I appreciate that, Mr. Zuckerberg. I think the question again here is, when the dominant platform threatens its potential rivals, that should not be a normal business practice. Facebook is a case study, in my opinion, in monopoly power because your company harvests and monetizes our data, and then your company uses that data to spy on competitors and to copy, acquire, and kill rivals. You've used Facebook's power to threaten smaller competitors and to ensure that you always get your way. These tactics reinforce Facebook's dominance, which you then use in increasingly destructive ways. So Facebook's very model makes it impossible for new companies to flourish separately, and that harms our democracy, it harms mom and pop businesses, and it harms consumers. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
How would you respond to Representative Jayapal there, John Tamny? Because that is apropos of your point about monopolies and MySpace and Facebook and Google and all these big tech companies today.
Yeah, well, again, I think you answered it years ago in the sense that at one point, MySpace, which was owned by News Corp, was viewed as the impregnable monopoly. How'd that work out? Then some kid in a dorm room knocks them out. I'll add that Mark Zuckerberg plainly doesn't think he has a monopoly. And the reason he doesn't, obvious evidence of it, is that he purchased Instagram. He recognizes that young people increasingly aren't using Facebook, that he's got to figure out other ways to meet the needs of people if he wants to have market share. But the fact that they've got lots of market share right now is evidence that they met a major unmet need in society. And in terms of trying to learn more about their users, yeah, guess what? If you get something that you love for free, they are going to try to learn something about you, but they're going to try to learn something about you precisely because they want to figure out a way to better present to you with ideas and products that may actually appeal to you. The tragedy was in the old Soviet Union when businesses didn't care to learn about their customers because they weren't interested in profits. There was no need to. Service was bad. Facebook is doing this because it wants to create a better user experience to keep its users around, not to do something bad to them.
You know, one thing that the Wall Street Journal has in an editorial out today is a couple of paragraphs at the very end that I think are very pointed in this discussion. They say, in a democracy, any accumulation of wealth and power will get political scrutiny, and the tech giants are taking their turn in the dock. There are genuine concerns about political bias, the harm to journalism and democracy by Google's use of content without compensation, and perhaps barriers to entry. And I will say I agree that there are some things that are worthy of being concerned. Whether or not the government should get involved is a different question. But the market, the article goes on, usually does the best job of countering monopolies. Too often, government intervention reinforces monopolies. Antitrust law, since the work of Robert Bork and Yale Brosen in the 1970s, is rightly focused not on size, but on consumer harm. The burden is on the critics of big tech to prove genuine damage and then propose solutions that don't do more harm than good. Now, I don't think that these types of hearings should necessarily be held. I think we both agree on that point. But their point here is about damage, not the control of the market in this way.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things to look at that I would respond here. For one, try to go get money from a venture capitalist and say, yeah, I think we can maybe get some market share. The whole point is to pursue monopoly. That's why you're in business. You're in business to meet a need in the marketplace that hasn't so far been met. So if it's assumed right now that they've got monopoly, wow, let's cheer them on for having achieved that. More broadly, where I'd like to go with this is I'm very disappointed that so many on our side, they're just so paranoid. It's the big tech, it's China, everything. Where were we before Facebook, Google, and let's throw in Apple, the meaning of the smartphone? Our side, the right, let's call it the right wing, used to always complain, well, we don't have any power in the media. The media are so biased. They get to control, they report what the left wants to see. Well, nowadays, because of Twitter, because of Facebook, because of Google, we can get access. We can project our ideas and get them to people in ways that before this we never could. Where's the defense of what these people are doing? And then if we dislike it, some conservatives feel that, well, they're not being fair to us. It's just not right and everything. So start up your own. Why are conservatives so in support of affirmative action as in be nicer to us, treat us better nowadays? Stop it. Get with the program.
I think it's one thing for consumers to express themselves, John Tamny, and say, hey, I don't think you're treating us the way that you should be as consumers. Could be for political reasons. But when you get the government involved and you're looking to the government to provide some sort of solutions to your complaints, that's a different story. I think that what we will see over time is the development of new companies that will challenge these other companies. We've talked about MySpace, but what about Sears? I mean, look at Sears. It was the Amazon of its time, and now it's basically going away.
Oh, absolutely. Sears was pushed away. Do you remember A&P supermarkets? They were the dominant power 50, 60, 100 years ago. They're gone. That's what we constantly see. Guaranteed, certainly in your lifetime and probably mine, Amazon will not be the dominant power. This is the norm. And so if people dislike Twitter and Amazon and Facebook, there's the market opportunity. What did Rupert Murdoch didn't get in the fetal position and complain the media aren't fair? He started Fox News. And so if people are bothered by it, I haven't used it yet. I've heard there's something called Parlay, which is
Parler. Yeah. Or is it pronounced parlay?
Parler that's some kind of replacement for Twitter. If conservatives feel that they're not being heard enough or they're being censored on these, that's an economic decision that Facebook and the others can make. And if they don't like it, there's the market opportunity.
Yeah. Well, that's absolutely right. And that is the beauty of a free market. Boy, we never have enough time to get through all the stuff we want to talk about. John Tamny, I guess we'll just have to have you back at some point to talk about the Federal Reserve and their role that people think is just so impactful during this challenging time. But we got to run. John Tamny, editor of Real Clear Markets, thanks so much for joining us today. And, of course, VP of FreedomWorks.
Thanks for having me, Jimmy. Great show. Congratulations on all you're doing.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate it. Once again, John Tamny joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. In just a few moments, we will be joined by John Yoo, who is professor of law at Berkeley Law, and we're going to get his take on presidential power, particularly as it is wielded by President Trump. We've heard a lot of talk by Democrats about authoritarianism in the Trump administration and how dictatorial they have become. We will talk about that and the new book by Professor Yoo, Defender-in-Chief, Donald Trump's Fight for Presidential Power, when we return here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. We will take a break here in just one moment, and then we will talk with Professor Yoo, which should be a very fascinating discussion to be sure here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. By the way, please, if you have not done so already, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. Stay tuned. We'll be back in moments.
America's politics are crazy. The culture is in flux. That's why we work hard to help you keep up.
More politics, more culture, and more access.
We focus on the biggest stories of the day with some of the biggest names in politics and punditry.
Go to our website, WashingtonExaminer.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Do you suffer from feelings of entitlement, self-righteousness, and arrogance? Fits of resentment, anger, and hypocrisy? Terror that the world is going to end, or even worse, that the world isn't going to end and that things are going to get better? A deep need to point fingers, deflect, or deny? Uncontrollable stress, frustration, or depression? Fear of recession, fear of no recession? Then you may have PTDS, or President Trump Derangement Syndrome. Fortunately, there's new Magatol, the proven cure for PTDS. Just one Magatol a day realigns your sensibilities by bypassing erratic brain signals to amplify the logic receptors. Talk to your Obamacare doctor today to see if Magatol is right for you. Recommended dose of reality is at least once daily. Warning snowflakes. Side effects of Magatol may include optimism, hope for the future, good feelings about your country, accepting economic prosperity, renewed faith in capitalism, and admitting that things aren't so bad under Trump. If you discover you are allergic to common sense, stop use immediately and contact your doctor. Relax. Breathe. It's Magatol, from the makers of Triggerol.
Hello, Jimmy. This is President Ronald Reagan, calling from the great beyond on your hotline. It's a different number than the one I used to contact Mr. Gorbachev, but it's no less important, especially at this kind of time. Well, Nancy and I, we stay on the ranch now here in heaven, and we're your biggest fans. We sit out on the porch there, and I'll have my Nancy, bless her heart, she makes me some tea, and we listen to your show, every minute of it. We fully support you in what you're about to accomplish in the future. Nothing but peaceful progress. Some people say, well, what will Jimmy do now? Well, stand by, because you're going to see some real fireworks. This young man has so many great ideas, and so forth. Why, I hate to interrupt, Ronnie, but let me just say this about that. I couldn't agree more with the way that you and Nancy feel about this entire thing. Jackie and I have been observing and listening to the Sengenberger show, and with regards to that, he's on the edge of a new frontier. No looking back, and I declare that by the time this decade is out, he'll have a syndicated show that will spread all the way across the universe. Oh, well, Jimmy, that was Jack Kennedy. He likes to get every word in edgewise. I tease him a lot. He likes to go out on my boat there and tool around on the sailboat. Well, Nancy brings him lemonade. He enjoys it. Yes, we're both, all of us are big fans. Oh, well, Jimmy, it seems that Nancy's ringing that old chuck wagon dinner bell, and it's time to go get all the fixins. Coming, Mother. So, we'd just like to say congratulations. Well done. In closing, I'd like to say that if you ever run into an obstacle that seems too big or too daunting, well, I'll say this. Mr. Sengenberger, tear down that wall.
Breaking at this hour, Jimmy Sengenberger is currently at the crossroads of politics and economics.
Are you all right with being a shark maverick? Was it okay to team up with you?
I'm good, man. It's a partnership. We're like this, Jimmy. I got you.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of nonsense.
And ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce to you the host of Jimmy at the Crossroads, Jimmy Sengenberger.
Folks, I must say, the honor is all mine to have Mr. Matouche Magic, Nathan Matouche himself, producer extraordinaire, once again working the Matouche Magic and producing today here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. And it is such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today as we round out the month of July. And I have to tell you, it is positively crazy to think, at least for me, how fast this year is going. And it seems like it's a sort of a lost year of sorts. But we'll see what happens by the end of it with all the coronavirus pandemic and the riots and the chaos and all those things that seem to be just enveloping our country. If you have not done so already, once again, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter at SangCenter. That's Sang with an E, not an A, Center on Twitter. And on Facebook, facebook.com/Jimmy Sengenberger Pro will take you to the Jimmy Sengenberger Media Personality Facebook page. And at JimmyAtTheCrossroads.com, there you will find access to our shop with some really fun products for you there. You'll also find at JimmyAtTheCrossroads.com the Crossroads Club membership program and a lot of different resources, all of our content, and so many different things that you can access at JimmyAtTheCrossroads.com. Also, be sure to follow, like, subscribe, all those good things to our friends at the Washington Examiner on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and of course at WashingtonExaminer.com. We have excerpts that get posted from Jimmy at the Crossroads on the Washington Examiner YouTube channel, youtube.com/Washington Examiner, where you can catch key points from our interviews here on this very program. And fascinating discussion as always with John Tamny, editor of RealClearMarkets, of course, VP at FreedomWorks, who is always an advocate vigorously for the free market, unabashedly so, and that's something that I most certainly always enjoy. Brings out the most free market aspects of myself in those conversations, which I enjoy because, look, the free market is what has brought about prosperity, that has brought about opportunity, that has created so much for this country. So much for this country. So when we look at what's happening in this nation, we have to recognize that looking to the government as the solution to our problems is wrong. We sell the shirt that quotes Reagan. Remember the 9 most terrifying words in the English language. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Those are indeed the most terrifying words in the English language. The shirt's available at shop.jimmyatthecrossroads.com, or you could just go to jimmyatthecrossroads.com and click on the shop tab. All right, we got to take one more quick break. Still working on arranging our guest, John Yoo, professor at UCLA Berkeley Law and author of the new book, Defender in Chief. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger. You're watching, listening to Jimmy at the Crossroads.
Crikey, that was the biggest bloody mosquito I've ever seen. Wait, coming in. Oh, g'day, mate. You know, after a long day of kangarangling and croc roping, a man can really work up an appetite. Not to mention a whopper of a backache. I know a place, and that's why I like coming into the Back Out Steakhouse. The Back Out is the only place I know where you can sit down in a lumbar support barca lounger and enjoy a big juicy bandicoot steak or a thick koala chop served by a licensed chiropractor. And as you partake of your meal, your server will provide you with a spinal manipulation, neck twist, the hip alignment, the full Matilda. One visit to the Back Out Steakhouse and your spirits will return like an Abbo's boomerang. So the next time your back goes on walkabout and you're coincidentally, simultaneously craving a slab of cooked meat, waltz on into the Back Out Steakhouse. You not only feel good down under, but all over. Back Out Steakhouse! Good stuff, eh, Skippy? Bloody boomerangs. Back Out Steakhouse!
Hi, Jimmy. This is Bill Clinton calling your secret hotline here. I gotta keep it down because I'm calling from the doghouse here in Chappaqua, New York at our place. Don't even ask. All you need to know is she's on the warpath again. Oh boy. Hillary yelled at me for listening to you. I have to do it in secret. But I really admire your show. I really do. I'm calling to wish you the best. All the best. In the future and even right now. Oh, here she comes. Listen, I gotta go, but you got a great show and you're gonna do very well in the future, I'll tell you that much. Oh my God, I know it's gonna happen. She's gonna have me chapters of her book again. Put us both to sleep. I know what the title of her darn book should have been. Should have been called How I Dropped the Ball on the 2-Yard Line with 3 seconds left in the Super Bowl. I gotta go.
Welcome back, Jimmy at the Crossroads. I am Jimmy Sengenberger, your host for the program. Still bringing engaging, intelligent talk sang style in partnership with the Washington Examiner. And folks, it is always, truly, I say it, a pleasure and a privilege to be with you. It really is, especially as we go through these tense times and try to break it all down, make heads or tails of what's happening in this country, because there are so many different elements that are happening. In the United States of America, we have had the coronavirus pandemic, we've had the riots, we've had political turmoil and intrigue, we've had the greatest divisions that we have seen in many, many years. I would surmise that probably not since the 1960s have we seen this level of division, and especially when it comes to the presidency. I mean, now we literally have Democrats who are consistently saying that President Trump is an authoritarian who is shredding the Constitution, constantly violating it. In fact, we can go back to December of 2019 when Nancy Pelosi, and we have this in Cut 8, when Nancy Pelosi said that she was proceeding with articles of impeachment against President Donald J. Trump. Let's go ahead and roll Cut 8, please, Mr. Matoush.
The president's actions have seriously violated the Constitution, especially when he says and acts upon the belief. Article 2 says I can do whatever I want. No, his wrongdoing strikes at the very heart of our Constitution. A separation of powers, 3 co-equal branches, each a check and balance on the other. A republic, if we can keep it, said Benjamin Franklin. Our democracy is what is at stake. The president leaves us no choice but to act, because he is trying to corrupt, once again, the election for his own benefit.
Now, those words from Nancy Pelosi are the very first quote in the book authored by our next John guest here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Professor John Yoo is the Emanuel S. Heller Professor of Law at Berkeley Law, UCLA, Berkeley, and is co-faculty director of the Korea Law Center and director of Public Law and Policy Program there, and also author of the new book, Defender-in-Chief, Donald Trump's Fight for Presidential Power. And Professor Yoo joins us now here on the program. Welcome to the show, sir. It's good to have you.
Oh, thanks, Jimmy. It's great to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
I appreciate the opportunity. You have a very fascinating new book that delves into President Trump in a way that a lot of people haven't looked at him. You have Democrats. We just played the clip. You begin your book by quoting Nancy Pelosi in December of 2019 as she was moving forward with articles of impeachment. And that's a very interesting passage that kind of helps set the tone for even this year, because all we're hearing about is the authoritarianism of President Donald Trump and how he has vastly expanded presidential authority. Just kind of give us a sense, and we'll put your book up on the screen here, of what your the new book, Defender-in-Chief, is about, and why you began with that quote from Pelosi.
The book itself is a systematic look at President Trump and his constitutional positions and his constitutional battles. And the reason I started this way was back in 2016, I was wary of President Trump. I thought he was a populist, and populists like Andrew Jackson or FDR are the ones who usually want to burst the bounds of the Constitution to achieve their mandate. But what I found over the years, and more recently, even as you're saying this year, when you refer to the Portland and city disturbances, that it's President Trump's critics who have been the main people who have wanted to overturn institutions rip up constitutional standards, and overthrow the meaning that we have used to operate our politics for the last sometimes 200 years.
I think it is such a profound point that we have, first of all, I find it interesting when the Democrats bring up the Constitution. I just have to be honest with you, because so far astray have they brought us from the Constitution in so many different ways. But one of the areas we're hitting on here, and this is the subject of the book, is presidential authority, because we're consistently hearing that President Trump is overstepping his bounds. But your book explores this from a number of different angles. Overall, what's your assessment of how President Trump has approached the presidency?
Well, he wants to try to restore political control over this, as you point out, this gigantic government, mostly created by progressive presidents. And you can see a lot of the battles I try to talk about as a fight between President Trump trying to restore that original Spartan limited government of our founders, and to fight against this modern, sprawling, unaccountable bureaucracy. So take, for example, the Russia collusion investigation. We're still learning more about how that got started and how groundless it was. But one way to think of that is, right, under the 18th century Constitution, President Trump is the head of the executive branch. He's the only one constitutionally responsible for law enforcement. Everyone who works for him, prosecutors, attorney general, everyone, is a subordinate, is his assistant to achieve that job. And we hold them accountable through picking the president. Think about what Jim Comey wanted to do as head of the FBI. He said, basically, I get to decide who's fit or not fit to hold the office of president, because I'm part of this government that's separate, that's technical, scientific, professional, that should be insulated from political control. And so I think a lot of the fights you're seeing, you look at the constitutional level, what it is trying to restore democratic control over our government, and the government trying to stop that with the Russia collusion investigation, the Mueller investigation, impeachment. These are all like revolts by the bureaucracy against the people, the president that the people chose to elect and put in charge of.
Again, we're talking with John Yoo, who is professor of law at Berkeley Law, and he's author of the brand new book. Let's put it up on the screen again. Defender-in-Chief, Donald Trump's Fight for Presidential Power. And I want to play another clip, and then we're going to get to some specific elements of the Trump presidency that you discuss in your book, Defender-in-Chief, Professor Yoo. I want to get to cut 7 here. This is Mehdi Hasan over on MSNBC, and he was talking this week about how we have to start using the word fascism in describing the administration of President Trump. Let's take a look at this.
I've worked around the globe. I've interviewed prime ministers and government officials, dictators, despots, authoritarians. And I think it's time in America that we finally have a proper conversation about the F word. No, not that one. Fascism. I know, it's really controversial. People get very uncomfortable when you mention it. But to borrow a line, if not now, when? And if not us, the free press, then who? For far too long, we have shied away from saying the F word. For a lot of people, calling Donald Trump a fascist was just ad hominem, a lazy political insult. It was the liberal who cried wolf. And yet, look what happened the moment he took office. There was the Muslim ban, and the very fine people in Charlottesville, and then the kids he threw into cages and camps. But it's not stopped. Those were not isolated incidents. Just last month, the president had protesters, as well as reporters, outside the White House, tear-gassed and beaten, so that he could go for a stroll and have a photo op holding a Bible outside a nearby church. And we were told not to call that
Mehdi Hasan
fascism.
essentially saying there, he's saying it's time to talk about the word fascism when it comes to President Trump. No more setting that aside. He lists the Muslim ban and Charlottesville comments and kids in cages and gassing protesters outside the White House so that he can get a photo op. This is the narrative that is being presented about President Trump right now, is that he is a fascist and that he is doing whatever he can to become an increasingly authoritarian figure. In this moment, especially, Professor John Yoo, how do you view those ideas coming from the left that President Trump is a fascist and he's just trying to become a wannabe dictator to the point of becoming a dictator in full?
Yeah, sadly, this is yet another example of the dynamic I'm talking about in the book about how the left is the one that's gone to such extremes because of their hatred of Donald Trump that they're using the most outrageous language, that they're the ones who are really trying to upend the constitutional order. So take, for example, just the one that you were showing about the rioting in our cities. The president and the federal government have had an authority to protect federal buildings, personnel. Right? They have the authority to enforce federal law, whether that's the drug laws, the gun laws, interstate conspiracies. They even have the right to protect the civil rights of the people that maybe the city mayors aren't protecting, who are living there in fear of violence. This is not some power Donald Trump made up. This is a power that President Washington used at the very beginning. This is, remember the claim that President Lincoln made at the start of the Civil War. That's all he was doing with Fort Sumter, he said. And it's the people who are claiming this is an occupying army or this is fascism. They're the ones who I think are responsible for the extreme nature and polarization of our political debate today. I find it irresponsible.
Yeah, I think that throwing around words like fascism, he was making it seem like we've finally reached the moment where fascism is a necessary term for us to use. I mean, that's the mentality here that they're trying to present. But fundamentally, what we're talking about here is across the country, and what President Trump is responding to is the loss of individual liberty by thugs who are rampaging in these cities, in city after city after city. I mean, I'm here broadcasting from Aurora, Colorado. Denver and Aurora, Colorado are now in the thick of this with violence of our own. Of course, Seattle and Portland are hot button locations that people are focusing on. But what you have in these cities is a failure of local governments and state governments to protect individual liberty, property rights, to protect the safety of the people in those locations. And what President Trump isn't doing, though, is just taking on the authority of enforcing all of these laws in local communities. He's particularly trying to protect federal property and even getting intense pushback from that. And yet, he's the one person in some of these cities who's actually trying to enforce the law to the extent he can.
Yeah, in fact, one thing I think would have surprised the founders, the idea that a city or a state refuses to maintain public safety, refuses to maintain public health. Under the Constitution, cities and localities have the primary responsibility for policing, for safety and health. I don't think the founders could have imagined what we're seeing in Portland and Seattle and some of our other cities where the mayors just say they refuse to do it. In fact, I thought I saw the mayor of Portland was one of the protesters who was protesting in front of the federal courthouse. In those kinds of situations, then the federal government has to step in. The federal government has not just to protect its own facilities and not just to enforce federal law, criminal laws, but they're the constitutional rights of the people who live there. And if the city and states default on their responsibility to protect those lives and property, then there is a role for the federal government to do that instead in the most extreme situations.
Let's talk for a moment about Attorney General Bill Barr. He was testifying this week before Congress once again. This time he was being grilled by the House of Representatives for his defense of President Trump's policies and actions, and particularly in dealing with the riot crisis that we have spreading across the country. And basically, you have a lot of people, Professor John Yoo, who are saying that Attorney General Barr is just doing President Trump's dirty work. In essence, he's not abiding by the law or caring about the law. He's just trying to do whatever President Trump feels he needs, almost like a personal lawyer for the president. How do you assess the role that Attorney General Bill Barr has taken upon himself in this Trump administration and his relationship with President Trump vis-a-vis this important topic of your book on the presidency and its role?
I think Bill Barr's been the most valuable player in this cabinet. I mean, he's done a remarkable job. And what he's trying to do, again, as part of this bigger understanding of the Trump presidency I set forth in my book, is they are trying to restore elected democratic control over the great bureaucracy in charge of law enforcement. He is trying to get to the bottom of the Russia collusion investigation, because what that represented, I think he's quite right when he describes it this way, what that represented was this group of unaccountable officials, Jim Comey on who knows who else involved, who thought that they could use the powers of the government to deny the results of the 2016 election, to do extraordinary things like spy on the campaign of a major political party for president, and to continue doing it after that person won the election and was president. And the problem, the real constitutional threat in all this is that we're going to have some kind of bodies in government that are not accountable to the people, not accountable to the people we send to Washington, whom we elect, who think that they have the power to decide who gets to hold office and who gets to exercise power on our behalf. That is not the system the founders wanted. And I think Barr is doing a really good job taking a lot of arrows in that effort to restore that political elected control over our government.
One of the things that's been pretty striking to me is the fact that President Trump, and this is shifting gears to a very different area of conversation, but one of the things that President Trump has done remarkably is reduce the regulatory burden and try to cut back as best as he can to reverse many of the previous policies, previous administrations that have grown government authority to dramatic levels, and even working with Congress multiple times with the Congressional Review Act to go ahead and slash regulations permanently that had been on the books, so they couldn't just be reversed by the next president who could say, hey, let's just re-implement this regulation that we had in place before. It was the first time that we'd really seen a concerted effort by Congress working with the president, and he's done a heck of a lot in terms of trying to rein in some of the excesses of the administrative state in ways that I find pretty impressive. To the author of Defender-in-Chief, I'm curious what you think about that, especially in the context of the role under the Constitution of the executive branch and the lawmaking process.
It's a great question, and I know it's a great question. I wrote a whole chapter about this, and like you, I think it's one of the unheralded successes of the administration because it kind of happens beneath, beneath the surface of this vast government. But one thing that the administration has been doing, one thing I think that really had a lot to do with the way the economy was just booming until the pandemic hit, was that it was lifting all these burdensome regulations on American business. It was cutting red tape. It wasn't just tax cuts. So the tax cuts are important, but they create this deregulatory push created a lot more stability so that businesses could invest and innovate and hire, and that they didn't think that they would get sued or the rules would change on them or that the federal government would come after them. Because the American economy is so entrepreneurial and innovative, and the worst thing that's happening to it these days is that it's being stifled by its own government. And then a second part of that is that the president, that is also not just a power of the president, as you say, to issue executive orders, but it's also a limit because anything a president does on his own can be reversed by the next president. And I talk a little bit about that when it comes to immigration and the executive orders of President Obama and the Deferred Action for Children program. And that, I think, is also an important part of President Trump there trying to use his constitutional powers to undo what President Obama did, which I thought was unconstitutional, saying I'm not going to enforce the law as to millions of aliens, and try to force Congress to do its job, because really immigration law is up to Congress. And if there's supposed to be a DACA program or program for their parents, which many people in the country support, that's fine, but it's got to be passed by Congress.
And that, I think, as much as the economic benefit of the deregulatory effort of the Trump administration has been so important, the economic benefits are tremendous, especially right now while we're dealing with the pandemic. But it was one of the big reasons why the economy was so robust prior to coronavirus hitting. But that's the more critical point, which is reining in one area where the presidency has amassed greater authority than it should. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court has been giving it a deference in many circumstances here, when the lawmaking power is in the hands of the United States Congress.
Yes, in fact, this is the remarkable thing. I think President Trump came into office, used his executive power to say, I'm putting an end to this unconstitutional DACA program, and I'm asking Congress to pass legislation. He wanted to work out a deal on DACA. He actually has said he supports some kind of deferred program for these so-called dreamers. And then the Supreme Court just a few weeks ago, I couldn't believe the decision it issued. That Chief Justice John Roberts joined with 4 liberal justices to say, no, President Trump has to keep enforcing DACA, even though President Trump thinks it's unconstitutional, even though lower courts have struck down DACA as unconstitutional. Still, you have to keep doing it until you use this burdensome administrative procedure process that can take anywhere from 1 to 3 years. That does incredible. And so one thing I've argued in the book, and I've argued in the media since, is, well, if that's true, then the Supreme Court might have set back President Trump in the short term, but they just handed over a large amount of presidential power to him, because why does it have to be limited to DACA? President Trump could really reorient the immigration laws. It doesn't have to be even in immigration. He could really do a lot with different other policies, including tax, including criminal law. It could go on. And behind it is this idea, I think some of his critics have, is, oh, there's a constitutional law and presidential power that every other president gets to enjoy. But then there's a different kind of law, different kind of power that limits President Trump only. And that can't be right.
Two quick final questions for you, Professor John Yoo, our guest from Berkeley Law, professor there. The Trump judiciary, you have a chapter on the Trump judiciary, which is a rather interesting thing, especially when we look at two layers. One is what he has done with the lower courts, reshaping. Even the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals is pretty remarkable to see it turning increasingly more in a conservative or constitutionalist sort of direction, even looking at originalism or textualism. So you have that layer on the lower courts, so the appeals courts and the lower federal bench. But then you also have the interesting dynamics that have played out in the Supreme Court of the United States. I mean, we see some interesting decisions from a couple of from the two Trump appointees, but especially now with John Roberts becoming the swing vote, there are some dynamics in play there that are quite fascinating. But talk to us a little bit about what you see as the president, as in President Trump, specifically his role in the judiciary and restoring the constitutional order of government here.
Yeah, so, we can be unhappy with maybe one or two decisions that Neil Gorsuch or Brett Kavanaugh, who are the Trump justices on the Supreme Court, have made. But on the whole, they have been very conservative justices concerned with the text and the history of the Constitution. They don't believe their mission is to create new kinds of morals and norms for the rest of the country that aren't in the Constitution and are better left up for Congress and the states. And so, on the other hand, the effect has been that Chief Justice John Roberts, appointed by President Bush, has moved to the middle, and he has voted several times now with the Clinton and Obama justices to strike down President Trump's positions. And that's really a new change. Meanwhile, Justice Thomas, you've got there, and Justice Alito have joined, I think, on most cases with Gorsuch and Kavanaugh to form the conservative wing of the court. But Chief Justice John Roberts has become the swing justice, and it's hard to say the court is reliably conservative unless Trump were to win re-election and have the opportunity to pick a sixth justice. And then I quite agree with you. Also, the unnoticed story, I'm glad you mentioned it, is what's been going on in the lower courts. Trump has picked dozens upon dozens of court judges to the courts of appeal, and he has appointed an all-star team. When you look at the biographies of these young men and women who are ranging in these from about late 30s to early 50s, he has picked an all-star team. He has picked people who are young, aggressive, intelligent, and committed to constitutional principles. And it's important not just because that's where 99% of the cases end up in the lower courts, but it's also that's the farm team, that's the bench that will produce the next set of Supreme Court justices. So I think that could be President Trump's longest lasting legacy in terms of the Constitution, in addition to fighting to protect the presidency.
I would think so, particularly because he could be fighting to protect the presidency. The next president could do things differently. Congress can do things differently, but it will take a long time for Democrats to reshape the judiciary anew back in that direction that they were headed in, which was, I would say, in a direction away from the Constitution and certainly the original intent of our nation's founding document. Now, I'm curious, Professor John Yoo, is our final topic here before we let you go, and I really appreciate your time. It's a fascinating book, again, Defender in Chief. When we look at the Defense Production Act. When we look at what President Trump has done on trade, oftentimes in executive orders in terms of tariffs and what have you, in a variety of different areas where Congress has empowered the president to do different things that some may say, hey, that's too much power going into the presidency, but hey, he's got it at least presented to him because of Congress. He's not just taking it upon himself unilaterally and creating a new role. That raises this question, which is to what extent in some of those areas of criticism where conservatives like myself may say, hey, I don't think you should use this policy or take that particular step, even though it's authorized by Congress, to what extent is it that, something where the Congress has authorized the president to do certain things versus the president himself saying, hey, I'm going to go ahead and take this initiative and create something new out of whole cloth. And by the president, I mean President Trump.
Yeah, Jimmy, that's a great question because a lot of the things that President Trump has been attacked for, some of the things he was being called a fascist for, these are actually cases where Congress had the original power and they've given it to presidents. And they gave it to presidents long ago. And many other presidents have used that same power too. It's only when Trump uses the power that suddenly fascism has emerged. So to give you a great example, the travel ban. President Trump doesn't have the power over immigration. It's in Congress. But Congress gave the president the right to cut off travel from one country or another for national security reasons. Of course, that was a huge battle. And President Trump's view was ultimately vindicated only by 5-4 vote on the Supreme Court. Now no one questions it. Nobody's raising doubts about it when President Trump cut off travel with China when the pandemic broke out. Because that everyone recognizes, of course, really the president had that power. Same thing with the border wall. Other presidents have this authority. President Trump has it too, to declare a national emergency. And once he does at the border, he has the right to move money around from, say, military-based spending to building a wall. Again, that's not the president's constitutional power just to build things as he sees fit. He needs to get congressional permission and he needs to get congressional money from Congress. Again, Congress gave him that authority. He didn't seize it on his own.
This is the thing that's frustrating to me because in some of these instances, I don't think the president should have this kind of authority, but he does because Congress, in many of these cases, as you're pointing out, and we're discussing here, Professor John Yoo, he's been given that authority by Congress. But the problem is that so much of the discussion now has been about, oh, President Trump is just going too far. He's gone into the direction of a fascist, not Congress should rein in presidential authority in these particular areas and restore its ability to make laws relative to these things, and that it should be the central decision maker in these particular areas as opposed to the president. I think we're having the wrong discussion in so many different instances.
Now, actually, it's a great point, and what you're talking about is in the law, it's got this fancy name. It's called the non-delegation doctrine. Mm-hmm. And the question really is there a limit on how far Congress can go in handing off power to the president? And in a way, you could say all those delegations, all those transfers of power are not really in keeping with the original design of the Constitution, where the founders thought that the president on the one hand and the Congress on the other would be jealous and guarding their powers and would be using them to constantly fight. And that constant conflict between the two branches would be what would really keep the government limited and protect all of our individual liberties. What they didn't foresee was that Congress would actually rush sometimes to give these powers over because Congress doesn't want to take hard votes on controversial, difficult questions.
They want to wash their hands of the issue.
Exactly. And that was even before the pandemic.
And then complain when the president does it and not say, hey, we need the authority back.
Exactly. The political scientists say that's how modern Congresses get reelected. They give the president all the hard decisions. They don't want to take those votes. They just want to bring water projects back home. And then when the president decides it, they can criticize him no matter what he does. So, the courts have been careful. The Trump judges have actually really upper in the Supreme Court and the lower courts have been pushing the idea that there's got to be a limit to that. There's got to be a stop put to that. And then the other thing, and this goes again to the beginning of the interview about presidential power, President Trump has actually been trying to deregulate. And when you think about deregulation, it is an effort to stop using all of those powers that Congress has been handing off to make the government smaller and more modest, rather than, as you rightly say, past presidents have just rushed to use as much of that power as possible. And so maybe that's what, if you think about what would happen in a Trump second term, what the agenda might be, you might say that would be the complete agenda then, would be to try to really restore political control over the bureaucracy, stop it from attacking our elected leaders, and trying to slim it down and return back to a more modest Spartan government.
Well, I know, Professor Yu, that you once clerked for Justice Clarence Thomas, and what I would love to see is a Supreme Court full of Clarence Thomases, because then maybe we'd get a little bit closer to the original intent of the framers of the United States Constitution. Let's put the book up on the screen once more. Defender-in-Chief, Donald Trump's Fight for Presidential Power. The author, Professor John Yu, Emmanuel S. Heller, Professor of Law at Berkeley Law. Such a treat to have you on. I hope you'll come back. This was a very fascinating discussion and a fascinating and good read as well.
Oh, thanks so much. I really enjoyed it, and I'm happy to come back anytime you'll have me.
Absolutely. Professor Yu, you take care, be well, and thanks for your time today. Best luck with the book.
Thank you.
Once again, John Yu joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. And I definitely, this is the kind of discussion we need to have, is what really is the role of the presidency? And in what ways is President Trump actually in excess of the authority given under the Constitution? And to what extent is that excess that he is in, is that a result of Congress, not just President Trump unilaterally saying, hey, I'm going to do this? Because believe it or not, despite his rhetoric, he's not. In most of these cases, going in a way that has not been authorized by Congress. I think in some cases wrongly. I think the border wall, a national emergency declaration, I don't think it should be applied there, but it looks like statutorily the law is something that can be applied in that particular circumstance. I don't think that the president should be unilaterally able to implement tariffs on China in the way that he did, but Congress gave him the authority. I think the Defense Production Act is unconstitutional, where the president can basically commandeer private companies and say, hey, you're going to create PPE or this and that. I think that the way that that statute is structured is against the Constitution, but hey, it is the law of the land giving him that authority because of Congress, and the Supreme Court hasn't ruled that unconstitutional. Therefore, a president could go ahead and use that authority because Congress has given it to him. It is a fascinating discussion. Again, the book Defender-in-Chief, worth checking out. Now, something else that I want to wrap up with here on Jimmy at the Crossroads is an interesting point, because, look, we're talking about, one of the things we were talking about with Professor Yu is what President Trump has been able to do in terms of deregulation, scaling back the size and scope of government. But you also have Congress fighting to rein in some of the, in terms of Republicans, not to support some of these policies of expanding government and instead trying to shrink government to reverse some of these trends. Well, there's a program called Rising, put on by The Hill, and Sagar Enjeti was just on Tucker Carlson's program, and I saw this clip from their program, Rising, and I wanted to just give some thoughts on this, because I think he makes a remark that bears, in the context of what we're talking about with Professor Yu, that bears some comment, because it is not easy to reverse government, yet he gives this impression that it is. Take a listen to this.
So during the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, half of the majority governing party says they do not want to do anything. This is the logical consequence of the Republican Party today and what it has supposedly accomplished in office since 2016. And this perfectly reflects that. The only landmark legislation that has passed so far is the repeal of taxes. That's it. Repealing something takes no public policy effort. And that is why on so many of the other Trump promises that required actually doing something, they all failed. Building a wall, a new health care plan, building American infrastructure. They did not get accomplished, not just because they require money, but because they require the government to actually take on some proactive responsibility. It all comes back to ideology.
Replacing something takes no public policy effort. Tell that to the Republicans who were campaigning for years about repealing and replacing Obamacare. It's not just that they didn't put into place a new health care plan, although that was a big reason why it was a struggle to repeal it, because they couldn't agree on the exact pathway forward Fair enough. But they didn't even try to just repeal it outright. Yes, repeal and replace was a thing, but they could have repealed it and then replaced it. They didn't. We still have numerous programs that have been in place at the federal level that Republicans have railed against for decades, and yet they still exist. I've talked on this program about how the Department of Education is unconstitutional. It's not actually authorized in the United States Constitution. I again ask people to please show me where the Department of Education is authorized. So the Department of Education is established in the late 1970s under Jimmy Carter. And in 1979, the Department of Education goes into effect, and Ronald Reagan says, I'm going to eliminate the Department of Education. We've got to get rid of the Department of Education. He was unsuccessful. It was already entrenched. Numerous federal departments remain in existence that arguably shouldn't be in existence. Numerous federal programs that Republicans have consistently for years, even decades, have railed against still exist. The only instance that you can really think of where you've had some notable rollback was welfare reform in the 1990s under President Bill Clinton. Tax cuts are one thing. When you reduce the tax rate, the tax burden on the American people, that's great. That can help unleash individual economic potential. I talk about unleashing the unlimited potential of each and every individual. That helps to accomplish that. Cutting regulations, that helps to accomplish that. And a president can do it, but another president can reverse that, implement new regulations pretty easily. However, when we look at repealing laws or scaling back government, that's not something Republicans have done. Certainly, if they have, it's been very few and far between the instances that we've seen of this. The reality is that it is not easy. In fact, it is easier to put in a new government program than to scale it back or to fundamentally change it. Look at George W. Bush. In the mid-2000s, he's reelected as President of the United States, and he tries to use his political capital in 2005 to change Social Security and allow people personal accounts, where you as an individual can set up a personal account instead of and invest privately instead of going through the traditional Social Security route. That was not eliminating Social Security by any stretch, but it was trying to change the program in order to give it more solvency and to give individuals greater choice and opportunity for themselves. So when we look at that instance, he was unsuccessful with a Republican Congress. It was not easy for him to do that, to the point where he was unsuccessful in doing it. On the other hand, he grew government with the No Child Left Behind Act. It is far easier for government to grow and to add new programs. Maybe it's not in the way certain people would like. If you want a new program, you might not like the new program that you end up getting, but it's kept growing and growing. It is far easier to grow government. I cannot figure out any significant instances other than welfare reform that are really major of rolling back government. I don't mean some of the chipping away. We've seen some progress in different areas under President Trump and before when we had a Republican Congress, and I mentioned they used the Congressional Review Act like 15 times to permanently toss certain regulations. I'm talking about the bigger stuff, the meaningful programs. No, I respectfully disagree with Sagar and Jetty. Repealing something absolutely takes public policy effort. You have to persuade the American people that repealing a law or a program, especially one that is entrenched in our society, is better. But you don't just have to persuade them. You have to let the media enable you to get that message across. And then you have to persuade politicians that they should go this route, even though there can be some scaremongering about the implications. That is to say, the Democrats can say, oh, they're going to push Granny off the cliff because they're trying to reform Medicare. Remember? That was used against Paul Ryan when he ran, was that running for vice president, I think? In 2012 or thereabouts, when they were saying, hey, the Republicans want to push Granny off the cliff. That's the kind of fear-mongering that happens when you try to repeal government programs. So actually, it takes multitudes the amount of effort to repeal a law, to repeal a program, as it does to put a new one in place. That is it for us today. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us on Jimmy at the Crossroads. My thanks to the Johns that we both had. We had John Tamny, and then John Yoo, professor, author of Defender-in-Chief, Donald Trump's Fight for Presidential Power, fascinating book. Check it out. My thanks as well to Nathan Matoush, producer extraordinaire, to our partners at the Washington Examiner. Again, to you for joining us today here on the show. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. We'll be back tomorrow for the last day of July. Have a great day. Stay safe, stay well, stay healthy, and may God bless America.